Darwin, Fred Hoyle, and Albert Einstein. Most of these names are probably familiar to most or all of you. Maybe Fred Hoyle is a bit less familiar in this country, but he was one of the greatest astrophysicists of the 20th century, and certainly it was extremely well known in the UK. There are a few things that guided my thinking in terms of the people I chose and what I decided to do. So the first thing I should note is I only chose to discuss one blunder for each person, rather than making, a laundry list of all the possible mistakes that everyone has made. I should also say that in my choice of these people, I decided not to go too far back. In the sense that, you see, suppose I look at Aristotle. Essentially, everything that Aristotle said in physics is wrong. Now, that doesn't make him any less of a genius than what he was. He just, works against a different background. So I only went back to the middle of the 19th century. There is also something that guided my choice of these 5 people, and that is the concept of evolution. And by that I mean evolution of life on Earth, evolution of the Earth itself, evolution of stars, and evolution of the universe as a whole. So the concept of evolution runs through all my people here. So now let me start. The first thing you notice about life on Earth is how diverse it is. It's enough, to go outside here now, and you're going to see lots of plants, insects, some people walking their dogs, birds fly, and so on. Nobody actually even knows precisely how many species there are on Earth. The latest very serious attempt to actually put a number on that came up with something like 8.7 million species. But numbers range all the way from 5 to about 100 million. And it's easy to see why there is such a large uncertainty, because number one, every year they discovered new species, and plus, you have to realize it's enough to take a teaspoon of dirt from under your feet, and there already are thousands of species in there. So we don't know how many, but we know that it's a very, very large number. The second thing we notice about life on Earth is an incredible degree of adaptation, and also this kind of scratch my back and I'll scratch yours type relationship, which we like to call symbiosis. You look at the bee, and the bee has precisely the size that it fits into the flowers on which it feeds, and then the pollen gets on the bee's legs and body, and she moves it to the other flower and all that and so on. This clownfish that I have here, it lives among the poisonous tentacles of the sea anemone. The fish protects the anemone protects the fish. The fish has this special mucus on its body that protects it against the poison of its host. So all of this, this kind of very, very symbiotic relation. Now, these two facts, the enormous diversity and the incredible degree of adaptation, convinced many, many naturalists over centuries that there has to be some guiding hand, and I don't know what, and things like that. All of that changed when this gentleman here published in 1859 this book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. This is, of course, Charles Darwin. Here he is when he was old. By the way, just as an aside, when I write my books, I like to go to the places where the people actually worked, and so I actually did hold in my hand the first copy of Darwin's book, and I can tell you, for a generation that maybe grew up with seeing everything on computer screens, that for me it's still a special feeling to hold that book in my hand. I know it's not for everybody. I put this slide here not because it is correct, which it isn't, but because it's very pretty from a graphics design perspective. It is supposed to describe evolution, and I think you will agree with me that it's a very pretty slide. The reason I say it's not correct is that when you look at a slide like this, you get the impression that things here are more evolved perhaps than things here, and that's not the case. I mean, evolution doesn't work like a ladder. It works more like a bush. Namely, things evolve in different directions. But things that are equidistant from the origin are equally evolved. So that's how this thing goes. There is one thing that Darwin didn't like to publish, and that was genealogy trees. He never published one. But in his own notebooks, and I held those in my hand, he actually did draw some of those in order to guide his thoughts. I like very much this one because, look, it has primates down here and man up there. So he did do such things for himself, but he never published. Now, what is this theory of evolution that Darwin came up with? The theory of evolution has four pillars, four major pillars, and those four major pillars are supported by one grand mechanism. Now, this figure here has nothing to do with Darwin's theory of evolution. It comes from a Hindu myth. But you see, it has four pillars, and they are supported by one grand mechanism. So I thought it fits here. There is, by the way, a story that is almost certainly not true. I could never find out that it was actually true. But it is such a good story that I will tell you the story nonetheless. I mean, there is a proverb in Italian, some of you may know, "Si non è vero è ben trovato," which basically says, even if it's not true, it's a good story. So I'm going to tell you that story. And the story is that Bertrand Russell, the famous mathematician and philosopher, once gave a talk, and he had a drawing something. And some woman in the audience was Mr. Russell giant on stick. And he said, "Oh, remember, giant." And he said, "Oh, the step turns stick." He said, "Let's do it." And the woman insisted on the step turn. He said, "Lady, I'm afraid for you. All the way down." Now, this almost certainly happened, but it's a very good story. Now, what are these four pillars? First stage of his life. Now, as I said, these four pillars are supported by one grand mechanism, and that grand mechanism is natural selection. There is a philosopher at Tufts, Daniel Dennett, who wrote once that he thought that evolution by means of natural selection, that is the greatest single idea that anybody has ever had. You know, maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it certainly is a fantastic idea. And like all of the great ideas, you know, it sounds simple once it's pointed out to you. And the idea is the following. What does natural selection tell us? It tells us, look, suppose you have certain members of a species, and suppose that some members of that species have a certain characteristic that gives them an advantage both in terms of coping with their environment, with predators, I don't know what, so that, and also in terms of the production of offspring. Very important. Then, Darwin tells us, over many, many generations, the entire population is going to shift towards that characteristic. You understand this, right? I mean, if that gives you an advantage and you also produce more offspring, then over many, many generations you shift everything towards that. That's the idea. Now, how does it actually work? Let's see a few very simple examples. So, in England of the 19th century, there was this white, light-colored peppered moth. And originally, it was so well camouflaged, look, you can barely see it here. So you can hardly even notice that it's there. But then, 1848 was the Industrial Revolution. They started pouring enormous amounts of soot into the atmosphere, blackened all the trees, and this light-colored peppered moth started sticking out like a sore thumb. So it became the target for massive predation, to the point that it became almost entirely extinct. At the same time, by the way, the melanic version, the dark version of this moth, of course, started thriving because, it was better camouflage at this point. Luckily for the light-colored peppered moth, even in England of the 19th century, they adopted somewhat greener practices, and this moth was actually saved from complete extinction. These pictures here just show very red snakes that evolved so that they adapt to their surroundings, and so on in terms of color. Now, where do we actually see natural selection the most today? With bacteria. Why? Because bacteria, the populations are humongous, and they multiply very fast. So the entire evolution process is compressed for them. And what does that do? I'm sure you just heard, actually a case has been now found in the US just last week of bacteria that are resistant to all forms of antibiotics. Every year, actually, in the US, you have something like 23,000 people who die because they are infected by bacteria that are resistant to most antibiotics. I mean, this case that they found last week is resistant even to this rare antibiotic that they hardly ever use because it had such severe side effects, and so on. But this is what happens. Now, they always try to present it to you as if we are to blame. And we are to some extent, in the sense that if the doctor prescribes to you antibiotics and she says you should take it for 10 days, you feel better after 3 and you stop taking it. That's not good. That's how resistant bacteria are. But that's not the main cause. The main cause, of course, is that the cattle and the chicken industry, the poultry, they just feed these things enormous amounts of antibiotics. And that's all part of business. And only about 2 years ago, they started to have some guidelines about how much antibiotics you can give these things. So anyhow, that's the situation. Now, from what I told you until now, you understand correctly that Darwin came up with a theory that explains almost everything about life on Earth. So where is the blunder? So the blunder had to do with heredity. At Darwin's time, Darwin didn't know any genetics. And we cannot blame him for that because nobody knew any genetics at the time. So Darwin adopted the theory of heredity that was the prevailing theory at the time, which was that of blending heredity, which means the characteristics of the mother and the father get blended in the offspring just like you would mix paints. Okay? Now, again, this is not a blunder because he didn't know any better. This was the best theory available. So he adopted that. That's not the blunder. The blunder was in not understanding that if this were the correct theory of heredity, natural selection could never have worked at all. And let me explain that. Okay? Suppose you have a population of